from her head. Maybe if she ignored the pain, it would go away this time. Besides, for a change, she had information to share with Swan. It seems that some of the sitters are talking about negotiating with Elida, she began. Expressionless, Swan balanced herself atop one of the two rickety three-legged stools in front of the table and listened attentively, only her fingers moving, lightly stroking against her skirts, until Egwene finished. Then she made fists, and growled a set of curses that were pungent even for her, beginning with a wish for the lot of them to choke to death on weak old fish guts, and sliding downhill fast from there. Coming from that young, pretty face only made them worse. I suppose you're right letting it go forward, she muttered, once her invective ran down. The talk will spread now it's begun, and this way you gain a jump on it. Bayanin shouldn't surprise me, I suppose. Bayanin's ambitious, but I always thought she'd have gone scurrying back to Elida if Shiriam and the others hadn't stiffened her backbone. Voice quickening, Swan fixed her eyes on Egwene as if to lend weight to her words. I wish Verilyn and that lot surprised me, Mother. Discounting the blue, 6 sitters from 5 Ajas fled the tower after Elida carried out her coup. Her mouth twisted slightly on the word. And here we have 1 from each of those 5. I was in Tel Aranriod last night in the tower. I hope you were careful, Egwene said sharply. Swan hardly seemed to know the meaning of careful sometimes. The few dream Terangrial in their possession had lines of sisters panting to use them, mostly to visit the tower. And while Swan was not precisely forbidden one, it was the next thing to. She could have put her name down forever without the hall granting her a single night. Quite aside from the sisters who blamed Swan for the tower being broken in the first place,
1 second, everyone.
She was not accepted back quite as warmly as Lyanna on that account, nor cosseted by anyone. Quite aside from that, too many remembered her rough teaching when she was one of the few who knew how to use the dream Terangrial. Swan did not suffer fools gladly, and everyone was a fool their first few times in Tel Aranriod. So now she had to borrow Lyanna's turn when she wanted to visit the world of dreams. And if another sister saw her there, the next thing to might become an outright ban. Or worse, set off a search for who had loaned her a Terangrial, which might end by unmasking Lyanna. In Tel Aranriod, Swan said with a dismissive gesture, I'm a different woman in a different dress every time I turn a corner.
There we go.
That was good to hear, though it seemed likely a lack of control had as much to do with it as intent. Swan's belief in her own abilities was sometimes greater than warranted. The point is, last night I saw a partial list of sitters and managed to read most of the names before it changed to a tally of wines. That was a common occurrence in Tel Aranriod, where nothing stayed the same for long unless it was a reflection of something permanent in the waking world. Andaya Foray was raised for the gray, Rena Hafton for the green, and Jewelaine Madoma for the brown. None has worn the shawl more than 70 years at most. Elida has the same problem we do, Mother. I see, Egwene said slowly. She realized that she was massaging the side of her head. The throb behind her eyes beat on. It would grow stronger. It always did. By nightfall, she was going to regret having sent Halima away. Bringing her hand down firmly, she moved the leather folder in front of her a half-inch to the left, then slid it back. What of the rest? They had 6 sitters to replace. Farana Neheran was raised for the white, Swan admitted, and Suana Dragant for the yellow. They've both been in the hall before. It was only a partial list, and I didn't get to read it all. Her back straightened and her chin shot out stubbornly. 1 or 2 raised before time would be unusual enough. It happens, but not often. But this makes 11, maybe 12, but 11 for sure, between us and the tower. I don't believe in coincidences that big. When the fishmongers are all buying at the same price, you can bet they were all drinking at the same inn last night. You don't have to convince me anymore, Swan. With a sigh, Egwene sat back, automatically catching the chair leg that always tried to fold when she did that. Clearly something odd was happening. But what did it mean? And who could influence the choice of sitters in every Aja? Every Aja except the blue, at least. They had chosen one new sitter, but Moria had been Aes Sedai well over 100 years. And maybe the red was not affected. No one knew what changes, if any, had been made in the red sitters. The black might be behind it, but what could they gain, unless all of those two young sitters were black? That seemed impossible in any case. If the Black Aja had had that much influence, the Hall would have been all dark friends long ago. Yet if there was a pattern and coincidence would not hold, then someone had to be at the heart of it. Just thinking about the possibilities, the impossibilities, made the dull pain behind her eyes grow a little sharper. If this turns out to be happenstance after all, Swan, you're going to regret ever thinking you saw a puzzle. She forced a smile saying that, to take out any sting. And Amerlin had to be careful with her words. Now that you've convinced me there is a puzzle, I want you to solve it. Who is responsible and what are they after? Until we know that, we don't know anything. Is that all you want? Swan said dryly. Before supper or after? After we'll have to do, I suppose, Egwene snapped, then took a deep breath at the abashed look on the other woman's face. There was no point taking her headache out on Swan. And Amerlin's words had power, and sometimes consequences. She had to remember that. As soon as you can would be very good, though, she said in a milder voice. I know you'll be as quick as you can. Chagrined or not, Swan seemed to understand that Egwene's outburst came from more than her own sarcasm. Despite her youthful appearance, she had years of practice at reading faces. Shall I go find Halima? She said, half rising. The lack of tartness attached to the woman's name was a measure of her concern. It won't take a minute. If I give way for every ache, I'll never get anything done, Egwene said, opening the folder. Now what do you have for me today? She kept her hands on the papers, though, to stop from rubbing her head. One of Swan's tasks each morning was to fetch what the Ajas were willing to share from their networks of eyes and ears, along with whatever individual sisters had passed on to their Ajas, and the Ajas had decided to pass on to Egwene. It was a strange process of sieving, yet it still gave a fair picture of the world when added to what Swan put in. She had managed to hold on to the agents that had been hers as Amerlin by the simple expedient of refusing to tell anyone who they were, despite every effort by the Hall. And in the end, no one could gainsay that those eyes and ears were the Amerlins, and that they should by rights report to Egwene. Oh, there had been no end of grumbling over it, and still was on occasion, but no one could deny the facts. As usual, the first report came from neither the Ajas nor Swan, but Lyanna, written on thin sheets of paper in a flowing, elegant hand. Egwene could not see exactly why, but you could never doubt that anything Lyanna wrote had been written by a woman. Those pages Egwene held to the table lamp's flame one by one as soon as she read them, letting the paper burn almost to her fingers, then crumpling the ash. It would hardly do for her and Lyanna to behave like mere strangers in public, then allow one of her reports to fall into the wrong hands. Very few sisters were aware that Lyanna had eyes and ears inside Tar Valon itself. She might have been the only sister who did. It was a human failing to watch keenly what was happening down the street while ignoring what lay right at your feet, and the light knew Aes Sedai had as many human failings as anyone else. Unfortunately, Lyanna had little new to communicate. Her people in the city complained of filthy streets that were increasingly dangerous after dark and little safer by daylight. Once, crime had been all but unknown in Tar Valon, but now the tower guards had abandoned the streets to patrol the harbors and the bridge towers. Except for collecting the customs duties and buying supplies, both done through intermediaries, the White Tower seemed to have shut itself off from the city completely. The great doors that allowed the public to enter the tower remained shut and barred, and no one had seen a sister outside the tower to know her as Aes Sedai since the siege began, if not earlier. All confirmation of what Lyanna had reported before. The last page made Egwene's eyebrows rise, though. Rumor in the streets said Gareth Bryn had found a secret way into the city, and would appear inside the walls with his whole army any day. Lyanna would have said if anyone had breathed a word that sounded like they meant gateways, Siuan said quickly when she saw Egwene's expression. She had read all of these reports already, of course, and knew what Egwene was seeing by which page she held. Shifting on the unsteady stool, Siuan almost fell off onto the carpets she was paying so little heed. It did not slow her down a hair, though. "And you can be sure Gareth hasn't let anything slip," she went on, while still righting herself. "Not that any of his soldiers are fool enough to desert to the city now, but he knows when to keep his mouth shut. He just has the reputation for attacking where he can't possibly be. He's done the impossible often enough that people expect him to, that's all." Hiding a smile, Egwene held the paper mentioning Lord Gareth to the flame and watched it curl and blacken. A few months passed. Siuan would have offered an acid comment about the man instead of praise. He would have been Gareth Bloody Bryn, not Gareth. She could not possibly miss doing his laundry and polishing his boots. But Egwene had seen her staring at him on those rare times when he came to the Aes Sedai camp. Staring and then running away if he so much as glanced at her. Siuan! Running away! Siuan had been Aes Sedai for more than 20 years and Amyrlin for 10, but she had no more idea how to deal with being in love than a duck had about shearing sheep. Egwene crumbled the ash and dusted her hands together, her smile fading. She had no room to talk about Siuan. She was in love, too, but she did not even know where in the world Gawain was, or what to do if she learned. He had his duty to Andor, and she hers to the Tower, and the one way to bridge that chasm, bonding him, might lead to his death. Better to let him go, forget him entirely, as easy as forgetting her own name. And she would bond him. She knew that. Of course, she could not bond the man without knowing where he was, without having her hands on him, so it all came full circle. Men were a bother. Pausing to press her fingers against her temples, it did nothing to lessen the pulsing pain. She put Gawain out of her mind, as far out as she could. She thought she had a foretaste of what it was like having a warder. There was always something of Gawain in the back of her head, and liable to kick its way into her consciousness at the most inconvenient time. Concentrating on the business at hand, she picked up the next sheet. Much of the world had vanished as far as eyes and ears were concerned. Little news came from the lands held by the Seanchan, and that divided between fanciful descriptions of Seanchan beasts delivered as proof they were using shadow spawn, horrifying tales of women being tested to see whether they should be collared as Damani, and depressing stories of acceptance. The Seanchan, it seemed, were no worse rulers than any others, and better than some, as long as you were not a woman who could channel, and all too many people appeared to have given up thoughts of resistance once it became clear the Seanchan would let them go on with their lives. Arad Doman was almost as bad, producing nothing but rumors, admitted as such by the sisters who wrote the reports, but included just to show the state the country was in. King Al-Salam was dead. No, he had begun channeling and gone mad. Rodel Ituralda, the great captain, also was dead, or he had usurped the throne, or was invading Saldaea. The Council of Merchants were all dead as well, or had fled the country, or begun a civil war over who the next king was to be. Any of those might have been true, or none. The Ajahs were accustomed to seeing everything, but now a third of the world had been enveloped in dense fog, with only the tiniest gaps. At least, if there were any clearer views, no Ajah had deigned to pass on what they saw there. Another problem was that the Ajahs saw different things as having paramount importance and largely ignored anything else. The Greens, for example, were particularly concerned over tales of borderland armies near New Brame, hundreds of leagues from the blight they were supposed to be guarding. Their report talked of the Borderlanders, and only the Borderlanders, as if something had to be done and done now. Not that they suggested anything or so much as hinted, Yet frustrations came through in the cramped, hasty handwriting that spidered urgently across the page. Egwene had the truth of that situation from Elaine, but she was content to let the Greens gnash their teeth for the moment, since Siuan had revealed why they were not rushing off to set matters straight. According to her agent in New Brame, the Borderlanders were accompanied by 50 or 100 sisters, perhaps 200. The number of Aes Sedai might be uncertain, and it must be wildly inflated, of course, but their presence was a fact the Greens had to be aware of, though the reports they sent to Egwene never mentioned them. No Aja had mentioned those sisters in their reports. In the end, though, there was little difference between 200 sisters and 2. No one could be certain who those sisters were, or why they were there. Yet poking a nose in would surely be seen as interfering. It seemed strange that they could be engaged in a war between Aes Sedai and still be held back from interfering with another sister by custom, but thankfully it was so. At least they don't suggest sending anyone to Caemlyn. Egwene blinked, the pain behind her eyes sharpened by following the tight letters. Siuan gave a derisive snort. Why should they? As far as they know, Elaine is letting Marililla and Van Deen guide her, so they're sure they'll get their Aes Sedai queen, and a green at that. Besides, as long as the Ashamans stay out of Caemlyn, no one wants to take the chance of stirring them up. The way things stand, we might as well try pulling wasp jellies out of the water with our bare hands, and even the Greens know it. Anyway, that won't stop some sister, green or otherwise, from dropping into Caemlyn. Just a quiet visit to see one of her eyes and ears, or to have a dress made, or buy a saddle, or the light knows why else. Even the Greens? Egwene said tartly. Everyone thought of Browns being this way and Whites that, even when it was demonstrably not so. Yet sometimes she bristled a little at hearing Greens lumped together as if they were all the same woman. Maybe she did think of herself as a Green, or as having been one, which was silly. The Amerlin was of all Ajas and none. She adjusted the stole on her shoulders, reminding herself of the fact represented by those 7 stripes, and she had never belonged to one in the first place. Yet she did feel not fondness, that was too strong, a sense of sameness between herself and Green sisters. How many sisters are unaccounted for, Siuan? Even the weakest can travel wherever they want, linked, and I wish I knew where they went. For a moment, Siuan frowned in thought. About 20, I think, she said finally. Maybe a few less. The number changes day to day. No one keeps track, really. No sister would stand still for it. She leaned forward, carefully balancing herself this time when the uneven legs made her stool lurch. You've juggled matters beautifully so far, Mother, but it can't last. Eventually, the Hall will find out everything that's going on in Caemlyn. They might accept keeping the Seanchan prisoners secret. That will be seen as Van Deen's business or Marililla's, but they already know there are sea folk in Caemlyn, and they'll learn about the bargain with them sooner or later. And the kin, if not your plans for them. Siuan snorted again, though faintly. She was not certain how she herself felt about the idea of Aes Sedai retiring into the kin, much less how other sisters would take to the notion. My eyes and ears haven't picked up a glimmer yet, but somebody's will, as sure as certain. You can't delay much longer, or we'll find ourselves wading through a school of silverpike. One of these days, Egwene muttered, I'll have to see these silverpike you're always talking about. She held up a hand as the other woman opened her mouth. One day. The agreement with the sea folk will cause problems, she confessed. But when the Ajas hear hints, they won't realize right away what they're hearing. Sisters teaching sea folk in Caemlyn? It's unheard of, but who is going to ask questions or interfere against all custom? I'm sure there will be all sorts of grumbling, maybe some questions called in the hall, but before it comes out that there is a bargain, I will have introduced my plan for the kin. You think that won't sharpen their teeth? Shifting her shawl, Siuan barely bothered to hide her incredulity. In fact, she scowled with it. It will cause argument, Egwene allowed judiciously. A considerable understatement. It would cause an uproar, was what it would do once the whole was known. Likely as close to a riot as had ever been seen among Aes Sedai. But the tower had been dwindling for 1,000 years now, if not more, and she planned to put an end to that. But I do intend to go slowly. Aes Sedai may be reluctant to talk about age, Swan, but they'll figure out soon enough that swearing on the oath rod shortens our lives by half at least. No one wants to die before they must. If they're convinced there really is a kinswoman who's 600 years old, Swan said in grudging tones, and Egwene sighed with vexation. That was another thing the other woman was uncertain about, the kin's claims of longevity. She valued Swan's advice, valued that she did not just say what Egwene wanted to hear, but at times the woman seemed to drag her heels as hard as Ramonda or Lelaine. If need be, Swan, she said irritably, I'll just let the sisters talk to a few women 100 years or more older than any of them. They may try to dismiss them as wilders and liars, but Rihanna Corley can prove she was in the tower and when. So can others. With luck, I'll convince the sisters to accept being freed of the 3 oaths so they can retire into the kin before they ever learn there's a bargain with the Atha-Anmir. And once they accept any sister being freed of the oaths, it won't be nearly as hard to convince them to let the Seafolk sisters go. Beside that, the rest of that agreement is small turnips. As you keep saying, skill and a deft hand are necessary to get anything done in the hall, but luck is absolutely required. Well, I'll be as skillful and deft as I can be, and as for luck, the odds seem to be in my favor for once. Swan grimaced and hemmed and hawed, but she had to agree in the end. She even agreed that Egwene might pull it off, with luck and timing. Not that she was convinced about the kin or the agreement with the Atha-Anmir, either one, but what Egwene proposed was so unprecedented that it seemed the greater part of it might pass the hall before they realized what was falling on them. Egwene was willing to settle for that. Whatever was laid before the hall, almost always enough sitters stood in opposition to make finding a consensus hard work at best, and nothing was done in the hall without at least the lesser consensus, and usually not without the greater. It seemed to her that most dealings with the hall consisted of convincing them to do what they did not want to. There was certainly no reason for this to be any different. While the Greens concentrated on the borderlanders, the Greys focused south at present. Every Ajo was fascinated by the reports from Ilion and Tyr of large numbers of wilders among the Seafolk, which they found interesting if true, though there seemed strong doubt that it could be true, or else sisters would have known about it before this. After all, how could such a thing be hidden? No one mentioned that they had just accepted what they saw on the surface, and it was deeper. The Greys, though, were fascinated by the continued Seanchan threat to Ilion, and the recently begun siege of the Stone of Tyr. Wars and threats of war always mesmerized Greys, since they were dedicated to ending strife. And to extending their influence, of course. Every time the Greys stopped a war with a treaty, they increased the influence of all Aes Sedai, but of Greys most of all. The Seanchan seemed beyond negotiation, however, at least by Aes Sedai, and the Greys' outraged sense of being thwarted came through in curt words about Seanchan incursions across the border, and the increasing forces being gathered by Lord Gregorin, the steward in Ilion for the Dragon Reborn, a title that was a matter of some concern in itself. Tyr had its own steward for the Dragon Reborn, the High Lord Darlin Cisnera, and he was besieged in the stone by nobles who refused to accept Rand. It was a very strange siege. The stone had its own docks, and Darlin's enemies could not cut off supplies, even holding the rest of the city as they did, and they seemed content to sit and wait in any event. Or perhaps they just could not see what to do next. Only the Aiel had ever taken the stone by assault, and no one had ever starved it out. The Greys had some hopes in Tyr. Egwene's head came up as she read to the bottom of the page, and she hurriedly set that page down and picked up the next. The Greys had some hopes. Apparently a Grey Sister had been recognized coming out of the stone and followed to a meeting with High Lord Tadosian and High Lady Estunda, two of the most prominent among the besiegers. "Marana," she breathed. "They say it was Marana Ambry, Swan." Unconsciously, she massaged her tail. The pain behind her eyes had ratcheted into fire. "She may do some good." Rising, Swan crossed the carpets to a small table against the tent wall, where several mismatched cups and 2 pitchers sat on a tray. The silver pitcher held spiced wine and blue-glazed pottery tea, both set there at first light against the Amerlin's arrival, and both long since gone cold. No one had expected Egwene to go riding off to the river. As long as Tadosian and the others didn't realize who she's really working for. Swan's shawl slipped off one shoulder as she felt the side of the pottery pitcher, and the light of Sidar surrounded her briefly as she channeled fire, warming the contents. They won't trust her to negotiate in good faith if they find out she's the Dragon Reborn's creature. Filling a polished pewter cup with tea, she added generous dollops from the honey jar, stirring it in well, and brought the cup back to Egwene. "This might help your head. It's some sort of herb concoction Chesa found, but honey cuts the taste." Egwene took a cautious sip and set the cup down with a twist. If it tasted that sharp with honey, she did not want to imagine it without. The headache might be better. "How can you take this so calmly, Swan? Marana turning up in Tyr is the first real proof we've had. I'll take your sitters as coincidence before that." In the beginning, there had only been sisters, from the eyebrows in Swan's eyes and ears. There were Aes Sedai and Kyrian, and they seemed to move freely in and out of the Sun Palace while the Dragon Reborn was there. Then the whispers grew hoarse and uneasy, hesitant. The eyes and ears in Kyrian did not want to say it. No one wanted to repeat what their agents said. There were Aes Sedai and Kyrian, and they seemed to be following the orders of the Dragon Reborn. Worse were the names that trickled out. Some were women who had been in Salidar, among the first to resist Alada, while others were women known to be loyal to Alada. No one had mentioned compulsion aloud that Egwene knew of, but they had to be thinking it. "No use pulling your hair when the wind isn't blowing the way you want," Swan replied, taking her stool again.
"Excuse me, everyone."
She started to cross her knees, but hastily put both feet back on the carpet when her stool tilted. Muttering under her breath, she adjusted her shawl with a twitch of her shoulders, and was forced to balance against another lurch. "You have to trim your sails to take advantage of how the wind is blowing.
D-Man, how you doing?
Think coolly and you'll make it back to shore.
Good morning.
Get your neck hot and you'll drown." Sometimes
How's your day
Swan
going,
could
or
sound as
evening
if she
going?
still worked a fishing boat. "I believe you need more than one sip for that to do any good, Mother." With a grimace, Egwene pushed the cup a little farther from her. The taste clinging to her tongue was
See
at
what my
least
brother
as
got
bad
me,
as her headache.
D-Man?
"Swan, if you see a way to make use of this, I wish you'd tell me. I don't even want to think about using the fact that Rand may have compelled sisters. I don't want to think about the possibility that he could have. Neither about the possibility that he knew such a repulsive
Oh, shit.
weave,
Hell yeah.
or that he could lay that weave on anyone. She knew it, another little gift from Mogadeen, and she very much wished she could forget how to make it. In this case, it isn't so much a matter of using as
How you
figuring out
liking
the
it?
effects. He'll have to be dealt with eventually, and maybe taught a lesson, but you don't want sisters flying off after him now. And these tales out of Kyrian make everyone cautious.
Chicago Bears won.
Swan's voice was calm enough, but she fidgeted, clearly
this is,
agitated inwardly.
Just the World
It was
Heavyweight
nothing any
Championship
Aes
one.
Sedai could speak of too
But I
calmly.
seen
At the same time,
the
once everyone
NFL
thinks
and,
it through, they'll realize this makes nonsense out of
baseball
those
ones they
stories
have.
about him submitting to Elida. She might
I'm
accept
happy with
sisters to
this.
watch
I've
over
always
him,
wanted
but
a
they wouldn't accept sisters who want to pull Elida
belt
down.
like this.
Realizing
Yeah,
that
this,
will put a
was
little
actually,
backbone in those who've started thinking maybe Elida has him
The
on a
guy
lead.
that
That's one less reason
my
for
brother
anyone to
got it
consider
from,
yielding to
actually
her.
got it from the WWE
What about Katswain?
network
Egwene
website.
said. Of all the names coming out of
It
Kyrian,
comes
that
with
one
a
had sent the most shock through the
cool little
sisters.
bag to put it in.
Katswain Malydrin was a legend, and there were as many disapproving versions of the legend as approving. Some sisters had been sure it must be
So
a
you could
mistake.
keep it in so it doesn't
Catswain
get
must be dead by now.
damaged or whatnot.
Others just appeared to wish she were dead. Are you certain she remained in Carrion after Rand disappeared? I made sure my people kept an eye on her as soon as I heard her name, Swan said, no longer sounding at all calm. I don't know if she's a dark friend, I just suspect.
But I guess there
But I
was
can
a
guarantee that she was
a
in the
guy
Sun Palace
at
a week after he vanished.
the place where my brother works.
Squeezing her eyes shut,
That needed some
Egwene pressed the
cash.
heels of her palms against her lids. That hardly
My
seemed to
brother made
affect
him
the
an offer and
pulsing
he took
needle
it.
in her head. Maybe Rand was in company with the Black Sister.
Yeah, I do,
Or
man.
had
I'm not
been.
gonna
Maybe he had
be able
used
to,
compulsion on Aes Sedai. Bad enough on anyone.
do my
Somehow worse.
my
used
live
on Aes
streaming of my
Sedai. More
diamond art
ominous.
for a little
What
bit.
was dared against Aes Sedai was 10 times, 100
It's kind of been
times as
put on
likely to
hold
be used against those
for
who
the
could not
time being.
defend themselves.
It was disappointing
Eventually,
because
they
I'm
would
getting
have to
down
deal
on
with
it
him
lately.
somehow.
And
She had
definitely
grown
be
up with
putting
Rand,
some
yet
hours
she
in
could not allow that to
streaming
influence
if
her. He was the
if I had
Dragon
one.
Reborn now, the hope of the world, and at the same time, maybe the single greatest threat the world faced. Maybe. The Shan Shan could not do as much damage as the Dragon Reborn, and she was going to use the
But
possibility
cheap
that he
little
had
webcam I
compelled
bought
sisters. The Amerlin seat really
didn't
was a
last
different
very
woman
long.
from that innkeeper's daughter. Scowling at the pewter cup of so-called tea, she picked it up and made herself drink the vile stuff down, gagging and spluttering the whole way. Perhaps the taste would take her mind off her headache, at least. As she set the cup down with a sharp clink of metal on wood, Anaya pushed into the tent, mouth turned down, and a frown creasing her plain face. Karen and the others have returned, Mother, she said. Moria told me to inform you she has called the hall to hear their report. So have Esmeralda and Malind, Morvrin announced, coming in behind Anaya with Mirel. The queen seemed an image of serene fury, if that was possible, her olive face smooth and her eyes like dark embers, but Morvrin wore a scowl to make Anaya look pleased. They're sending novices and accepted running to find all the sitters, the Browns said. We can't catch a whisper of what Karen found, but I think Esmeralda and the others intend to use it to prod the hall towards something. Peering at the dark dregs floating in a few drops in the bottom of the pewter cup, Egwene sighed.
But these
She would
things,
have to be there too.
I looked
And
it up
now she would have to face the
on how
sitters
much
with
it
a
actually
headache
cost.
and that awful taste
These
in
things
her
ain't
mouth.
fucking cheap.
Perhaps she could call it a penance for what she was going to do to the hall. Chapter 19.
Yeah,
Surprises.
the price my brother
By custom,
gave
the
him for
Amelin was
this,
informed of the hall
even
sitting,
if,
yet nothing said they had to wait for her before starting the session, which meant that time might
even
be
if
short. Egwene wanted to leap to her
the
feet
guy
and march
bought it
straight to the
when
big
they're having a
pavilion before
discount
Moria
sale
and the other two
on the
could
WWE
spring whatever
website,
surprise they
which they
intended.
usually do at
Surprises in the
pay-per-views.
hall were seldom good. Surprises you learned
Yeah,
about late
that's what this
were
one
worse.
was listed under.
Still,
It's
protocols that were law, not
$4.99
custom, had to be
plus
followed
tax.
for the Amerlin
But
entering
my
the
brother
hall.
gave
So
him
she remained where she was,
a hell of a
and
lot
sent
less
Suan
than
to
that
fetch
for it.
Shiriam so she could be announced
Because
properly
they
by
do
the
have
keeper of
sales
the
for the
Chronicles.
pay-per-views, like
Swan
they'll
had
announce
told
it,
her
like have
that
so
was
much
really
off,
a
like
matter of
merchandise
warning
and
the sitters
whatnot
of her presence.
for a limited
There
time.
were always matters
And
they might want
even
to
if he
discuss
did
without
that,
the Amerlin
I've
knowing.
seen
And she
I
had not
watched
sounded
most of the
entirely as if she
pay-per-views.
were making a joke. In
And the
any
most
case,
they
there was
have
no
is like
point
20,
in going to the
30%
hall
off.
until she could enter.
Even at
Tamping down her impatience,
percentage off,
she propped
like
her
I
head on her
still lost
hands
money
and
on how
massaged
much
her temples as she
my
tried to
brother
read
gave
a
him
little
for
more
this.
of the Aja reports. Despite the vile tea, or perhaps because of it, her headache made the words shimmer on the page
I've
every
always
time
wanted
she
a
blinked, and
WWE
Anaya
belt
and the other two did not help.
since I was
No sooner did
since I was a
Swan
kid. I've
depart
always
than
wanted
Anaya
one,
tossed back her cloak,
and now
settling on the
I got
stool
one.
Swan had vacated. It did not seem to lurch under her uneven
man,
legs
I have
or
another
knee,
old
and began to
wrestling thing
speculate
I've
on
had
what
for a while.
Moria and the others were after. She was not a flighty woman, so her ventures were quite constrained, given the circumstances. Constrained,
like pillow type
but no
ones.
less upsetting for that. Frightened people do silly things.
I found
Mother.
that
Even Aes Sedai
in my
shivered,
mom's shed.
placing
I
her
didn't know she
hands
still
on her
had it.
knees. But at least you can be sure Moria will be firm about Elida, at least in the long run. She lays every sister who died after Suan was deposed right at Elida's feet. Moria wants Elida birched for every single death before she goes to the
Yeah, but
headsman. When
my brother showed me
harder
that
than
and
Lelaine in some
gave it
ways.
to me,
Tougher anyway.
he made my
She
day.
won't scruple
What can
at
I
things
say?
that might make Lelaine balk.
Made my
I'm
day,
very much
made my
afraid
week.
she will press for an assault on the city as soon as possible. If the Forsaken are moving so openly on such a scale, then better a wounded tower gets whole than a tower divided.
People, but
at least I
to me
fear
it
that's
does.
how Moria may see things.
Because my brother,
After
me
all,
and him will still
however
watch
much time we want to avoid
the
sisters killing
pay-per-views when it's
sisters,
on,
it wouldn't be the first time.
when they're on.
The tower has lasted a long
So
time
it's something that
and
me and him
healed
could
from
sit there and
many
enjoy
wounds.
together.
We can heal from this one, too. Anaya's voice suited her face, warm and patient and comforting, but making those remarks, it seemed like fingernails screeching down a slat. Light. For all Anaya saying this was what she feared out
I
of
got
Moria,
him 1 year for,
she seemed much in accord with the
can't remember if
sentiments.
it was for Christmas or
She
his
was
birthday. I got
deliberate,
him
unflappable,
an autograph
and never
of,
careless with words.
it was an American
If she
flag and it's
favored an
autographed
assault,
by
how many others did too?
Hacksaw Jim Duggan.
As usual, Mirelle was anything but constrained. Mercurial and fiery described her best. She would not know patience if it bit her on the nose. She paced back and forth as much as the confines of the tent allowed, kicking her deep green skirts and sometimes kicking one of the bright cushions piled against the wall before turning to make another round. If Moria is frightened enough to press for an assault, then she's frightened out of her wits. A tower too wounded to stand alone won't be able to face the Forsaken or anyone else. Malind is who should concern you. She's always pointing out that Tarman Gaiden could be upon us any day. I've heard her say that what we felt could well have been the opening blows of the last battle, and that it might happen here next. Where better for the shadow to strike than Tar Valon? Malind has never been afraid to make hard choices, or to retreat when she thought it necessary. She would abandon Tar Valon and the tower at once if she thought it would preserve at least some of us for Tarman Gaiden. She will propose lifting the siege, fleeing somewhere the Forsaken can't find us until we're ready to strike back. If she puts the question to the Hall in the right way, she might even get the greater consensus in support. The very thought made the words dance harder on the page in front of Egwene. Morvrin, her round face unrelenting, simply planted fists on ample hips and met each suggestion with a curt answer. We don't know enough yet to be sure it was the Forsaken. And you can't know until she says. Perhaps it was, and perhaps not. And supposition isn't evidence. It was said she would not believe it was morning till she saw the sun for herself. Her firm voice brooked no nonsense, especially jumps to conclusions. It was not soothing to an aching head, either. She was not opposing the suggestions, really, just keeping an open mind. An open mind could go either way when it came down to the sticking point. Egwene slapped the embossed folder shut on the reports with a loud smack. Between the disgusting taste on her tongue and the sharp throb in her head, not to mention their incessant voices, she could not keep her place to read anyway. The three sisters looked at her in surprise. She had made it clear long ago that she was in charge, but she tried not to show
Hey, D-Man, are you working on any,
oaths of fealty
any
or
diamond
no
art?
oaths of fealty. A young woman displaying
I know you're
temper
doing
was
the
too
Fortnite
easy to
now,
dismiss
but
as
just
sulky,
wondering if you're working
which
on
only
any
made her
diamond
angrier,
art.
which made her head hurt more.
I'm still working on that,
I've waited
mushroom
long
one.
enough, she said,
It's going a lot
making
quicker
an effort
now,
to keep her
so
voice smooth.
I should be done
Her
with
head
it
gave it a
here
slight
soon.
edge of sharpness anyway. Perhaps Shiriam thought she was supposed to meet her at the hall. Gathering her cloak, she strode out into the cold while still swinging it around her shoulders, and Morvrin and the other two hesitated only a moment before following in her wake. Accompanying her to the hall might seem a little like they were her entourage, but they were supposed to be watching her, and she suspected that even Morvrin was eager to hear what a Karen had to report,
Nice.
and what Moria and the rest intended
Yeah, I'm
to
still
fashion
working
from
on
it.
that same mushroom
Nothing
one.
too difficult to deal with,
I've been
Egwene hoped.
slacking
Nothing
a
like
little
what
bit, but I've
Anaya
been
and Mirelle
getting
thought.
on it just because
If necessary, she could
it's
try
at a
applying
part
the
where
law of war.
it's
But
going
even if that
faster
was
for me.
successful, ruling by edict had its
And then I
disadvantages.
start the big one.
When people had to obey you in one thing,
I'm
they
hoping
always
to
found
have
ways to wriggle away on others. And
a
the more they were
webcam
forced to obey, the more places they
before I
found
start
for
that
wriggling
one, so I can
away.
start that one
It was a natural
from
balance
start
you
to
could not
finish.
escape. Worse, she
Since
had
it is to
learned
be
just how addictive it was to have people jump
one
when
of the
she
bigger
spoke.
ones
You
that
came
I've
to
done.
take it as the natural way of things, and then,
Because,
when they failed
yeah,
to
that
jump,
will
you were
be
caught on the wrong foot.
the biggest one
Besides, with her head
that I start
pounding,
on.
it was pounding now, not throbbing, though perhaps not as sharply. With her head, she was ready to snap at anyone who looked at her crosswise, and even when people had to swallow it, that never went down well. The sun stood straight overhead, a golden ball in a blue sky with a scattering of white clouds, but it gave no warmth, only wan shadows and a glitter to the snow whereon it remained untrampled. The air felt as chill as it had by the river. Egwene ignored the cold, refused to let it touch her, but only the dead could have been unaware, with everyone's breath misting white in front of their faces. It was time for the midday meal, yet there was no possibility of feeding so many novices at once, so Egwene and her escort still moved through a wave of white-clad women, leaping out of their way and starting to curtsy in the street. She set such a pace that they were usually passed before the knots of novices could more than spread their skirts. It was not a long way, with only 4 places that they needed to wade across the muddy streets. There had been talk of wooden bridges, tall enough to ride under, but bridges suggested a permanence to the camp that no one wanted. Even the sisters who spoke of them never pressed to have them built, which left wading slowly and taking care to keep your skirts and cloak high if you were not to arrive filthy to your knees. At least the remaining crowds vanished as they approached the hall. That stood alone as always, or nearly so. Nisao and Carlinia were already waiting in front of the big canvas pavilion with its patched side curtains, the tiny yellow fretting her underlip with her teeth and eyeing Egwene anxiously. Carlinia was calmness itself, blue-eyed, hands folded at her waist. Except that she had forgotten her cloak. Mud stained the scroll-embroidered hem of her pale skirt, and her cap of dark curls badly needed cleaning. Making their courtesies, the pair joined Anaya and the other 2, a little distance behind Egwene. The lot of them murmured softly, the snatches that Egwene caught innocuous, about the weather, or how long they might have to wait. This was no place for them to seem too closely associated with her. Bayanin came down the walk at a run, her hurried breath misting, and skidded to a halt, staring at Egwene before joining the others. The strain around her blue-gray eyes was even more apparent than earlier. Perhaps she thought this would affect her negotiations. But she knew the talks would be a sham, just a ploy to gain time. Egwene controlled her breathing and practiced novice exercises, yet none of it helped her head. It never did. There was no sign of Shiriam among the tents in any direction, but they were not precisely alone on the walkway outside the pavilion.
I've got my mom
Karen and the
into
5 other
doing a
sisters who
diamond
had gone
thing
with
with my
her,
mom and
one
that.
from each Aja, were waiting in a cluster on the other side of the entrance.
They bust
Most
them out pretty
offered
quick.
curtsies
Like,
to Egwene distractedly,
at least my mom,
yet kept their distance. Perhaps they had
she
been
puts me to
warned to say
shame, man.
nothing to anyone until they spoke
I got her
before the
started
hall.
doing them, and
Egwene could simply
she
have
busts them
demanded
out
their
quicker
report
than
on
I
the
do.
spot, of course. They might even have given it to the Amerlin.
Takes her
Likely
like
they would have. On
2
the
or
other
3
hand,
days
an Amerlin's relations with the
to get
Ajas
one
were
pretty much
always
all the way done.
delicate, often including the Aja she had been raised from. Nearly as delicate as relations with the Hall. Egwene made herself smile and bow her head graciously. If she gritted her teeth behind that smile, well, that helped keep her mouth shut. Not all of the sisters seemed aware of her presence. Karen, slender in plain brown wool and a cloak with surprisingly elaborate green embroidery, was staring at nothing, nodding to herself now and then. Apparently she was practicing what she would say inside. Karen was not strong in the power, little more than Suan, if at all, but only one other of the 6, Thurva, a slim woman in yellow-slashed riding skirts and a cloak edged with yellow, stood even as high as she. That was a distressing measure of just how frightened the sisters were by that strange beacon of Saidar. The strongest should have stepped forward for the task that had been given to these, but except for Akaran herself, zeal had been notably lacking. Her companions still appeared less than enthusiastic. Shauna normally maintained a deep reserve, despite eyes that made her appear constantly startled, but now they seemed ready to come out of her head with worry. She peered at the entrance to the hall, closed off by heavy flaps, and her hands fiddled with her cloak as if she could not keep them still. Raiko, a stout Arafellan blue, kept her eyes down, but the silver bells in her long dark hair chimed faintly, as if she were shaking her head inside her cowl. Only Thurva's long-nosed face wore a look of absolute serenity, completely unperturbed and unshakable, yet that in itself was a bad sign. The Yellow Sister was excitable by nature. What had they seen? What were Moria and the other two sitters after? Egwene controlled her impatience. The hall plainly was not sitting yet. It was gathering, but several sitters strolled past her and into the big pavilion, none hurrying. Salita hesitated as if she might speak, but then only dipped her knees before raising her yellow-fringed shawl onto her shoulders and sweeping inside. Quamesa peered down her sharp nose at Egwene while making her curtsy, and peered down her nose while studying Anaya and the others briefly, but then the slim gray peered down her nose at everyone. She was not tall, but she tried to seem so. Barana, face a mask of haughtiness and big brown eyes as cold as the snow, paused to offer cool courtesies to Egwene and frown at Akaran. After a long moment, perhaps realizing that Akaran did not even see her, she smoothed her silver-embroidered white skirts, which did not need it, adjusted her shawl along her arm so the white fringe hung just so, and glided through the entry flaps as though she just happened to be going in that direction. All three were among the sitters Swan had pointed out as too young, as were Malind and Esmeralda. But Moria had been Aes Sedai for 130 years. Light. Swan had her looking for conspiracies in everything. Just as Egwene began to think that her head would explode from frustration, if not from her headache, Shiriam suddenly appeared, hiking her cloak and skirts while half running across the dirty slush of the street. "I'm terribly sorry, Mother," she said breathlessly, channeling hurriedly to clean off the mud she had splashed on herself. It fell to the walkway in a dry powder when she twitched her skirts. I heard that the hall was sitting, and I knew you would be looking for me, so I came as fast as I could. I'm very sorry." So Swan was still searching for her. "You're here now," Egwene said firmly. The woman must have been truly upset to offer apologies in front of the others, Akaran and her companions more than Anaya and the rest. Even when people knew better, they tended to take you for what you appeared to be, and the Keeper should not be seen apologizing and wringing her hands. Surely she knew that. "Go ahead and announce me." Drawing a deep breath, Shiriam pushed back the hood of her cloak, adjusted her narrow blue stole, and stepped through the entry flaps. Her voice rang out clearly in the ritual phrases. "She comes! She comes!" Egwene barely waited for her to finish with, "The flame of Tar Valon, the Amerlin seat," before striding in through the ring of braziers and stand lamps that rimmed the pavilion's walls. The stand lamps gave a good light, and the braziers, giving off a scent of lavender today, warmed the whole space. No one wished to have to ignore the cold when she could feel real warmth. The arrangement of the pavilion followed ancient rules, modified only slightly to allow for the fact that they were not meeting in the White Tower, in the great circular chamber called the Hall of the Tower. At the far end, a simple if well-polished bench stood atop a box-like platform covered with cloth striped in the round Egwene's neck, were surely the only places in the camp where the red Aja had. Some blues had wanted the color removed, since Elida apparently had had the actual throne called the Amerlin seat repainted, and a stole woven without blue. But Egwene had dug in her heels. If she was to be of all Ajas and none, then she would be of all Ajas. Down the bright layered carpets that served as a ground cloth, two lines of benches slanted away from the entrance in groups of 3, sitting atop cloth-covered boxes in the colors of the Ajas. Well, 6 of the Ajas. By tradition, the 2 oldest sitters could claim the places closest to the Amerlin seat for their Ajas, so yellow and blue held those spots here. After that, it was a matter of who came first and wished to be seated where, the first arrival always choosing her Aja's place. There were only 9 sitters present, too few for the hall to be sitting yet, legally speaking, but an oddity in the seating struck Egwene right away. Unsurprisingly, Romanda was already in place, an empty bench between her and Salita, and Lilane and Moria occupied the end benches of the blue. Romanda, her hair in a tight gray bun on the nape of her neck, was the oldest sitter, and almost always the first to reach her place when the hall sat. Lilane, next oldest despite her dark glossy hair, seemed unable to let the other woman gain a jump on her, even in something so small. The men who had shifted the boxes, they were stored along the walls until the hall was called to sit, must have just left through the back, because Kwamesa, already seated on her bench, was the only gray sitter in evidence, and Barana, just climbing to hers, the only white. But Malind, a round-faced Kandori with an eagle's eyes and the lone green, obviously had entered ahead of them. Yet, strangely, she had chosen to seat the greens near the pavilion's entrance. The nearer the Amerlin seat, the better was the usual thing. And directly opposite her, Esmeralda stood in front of the brown-covered boxes in hushed argument with Takima. Almost as short as Nisao, Takima was a quiet, bird-like woman, but she could be forceful when she wished, and with her fists on her hips she looked like a sparrow in a temper, feathers all puffed out to make her seem larger. By the way she kept darting sharp looks toward Barana, the seating was what upset her. It was too late for anything to be changed for this sitting, of course, but in any case, Esmeralda loomed back at Takima as if she expected to have to fight for her choice. It amazed Egwene how Esmeralda could do that. Loom, that was. She stood inches shorter even than Nisao. It must have been sheer force of will. Esmeralda never backed down when she thought she was in the right, and she always did think she was in the right. If Moria really did want an immediate assault on Tarvalin, and Malind really wanted to retreat, what did Esmeralda want? For all Suan's talk of sitters wanting to be warned, Egwene's entrance caused no great stir. For whatever reasons Malind and the others had called the hall to hear Akaran's report, they had not considered the matter so sensitive that it needed to be held for sitters' ears alone, so little clusters of 4 or 5 Aes Sedai were standing behind the benches of their Aja's sitters, and they made their curtsies as Egwene walked down the carpets toward her own seat. The sitters themselves merely watched her, or perhaps inclined a head briefly. Lilane eyed her coolly, then returned to frowning faintly at Moria, a quite ordinary-appearing woman in plain blue wool. So ordinary, in fact, that you could miss the ageless quality in her face at first glance. She sat staring straight ahead, absorbed in her own thoughts. Romanda was one of those to tilt her head a fraction. Inside the hall, the Amerlin seat was still the Amerlin seat, but a little less so than outside it. Inside the hall, sitters felt their power. In a way, the Amerlin could be said to be only the first among equals inside the hall. Well, perhaps a little more than that, but not by much. Suan said as many Amerlins had failed by believing the sitters were fully her equals, as by believing the difference was wider than really existed. It was like running along the top of a narrow wall with fierce mastiffs on either side. You maintained a careful balance and tried to watch your feet more than the dogs, but you were always aware of the dogs. Unpinning her cloak as she stepped up onto the striped box, Egwene folded it across her bench before sitting. The benches were hard, and some sitters brought cushions when they thought the sitting would be long. Egwene preferred not to. The prohibition on speeches seldom stopped at least 1 or 2 women from drawing their comments out at length, and a hard seat could help you remain awake through the worst. Shiriam took the keeper's place, standing to Egwene's left, and there was nothing to do but wait. Maybe she should have brought a cushion. The other benches were beginning to fill, though slowly. Eledrin and Saroya had joined Barana, Eledrin plump enough to make the other two appear slim. Of course, the vertical lines of white scroll work running down Saroya's skirts had that effect anyway, while Eledrin's wide white sleeves and the snowy panel running down the front of her dress did just the opposite. Each apparently was trying to find out whether the others knew what was afoot, from the way they were shaking their heads at each other and shooting glances toward the blues, the browns, and the greens. Varilyn, a red-haired stork of a woman and taller than most men, had taken her seat beside Kwamesa, too. Adjusting and readjusting her shawl restlessly, Varilyn darted her eyes from Moria to Esmeralda to Malind and back. Magla, yellow-fringed shawl wrapped tightly around her broad shoulders, and Faisella, a square-faced Domani in silks covered with dense green embroidery, were just entering the pavilion, each ignoring the other, even when their skirts brushed. Magla was firmly in Ramanda's camp, and Faisella in Lelane's, and the two groups did not mix. Other sisters were trickling in by spurts as well. Nisao and Mirel, among half a dozen or so who slipped in behind Magla and Faisella. Morvrin was already among the browns behind Takima and Esmeralda, and Bayanin stood on the edge of the greys behind Varilyn and Kwamesa. At this rate, half the Aes Sedai in the camp would be crowded into the pavilion before long. While Magla was still walking down the carpets toward the yellow seats, Ramanda rose to her feet. "We are more than 11 now, so we may as well begin." Her voice was surprisingly high-pitched. You might have thought she had a beautiful singing voice, if you could imagine Ramanda singing. Her face always seemed more set for scolding, at least slightly disapproving. "I don't think we need make this a formal session," she added when Kwamesa stood. "I hardly see why this need be done in session at all, but if it must, let us get it over and out of the way.
Definitely
Some of us
appreciate
have
it.
more important matters to deal with, as I'm sure you do, Mother." That last was said with a deep bow of her head in a tone perhaps a hair too respectful. Not far enough over the line to be called sarcasm, of course. She was too intelligent to place herself in jeopardy. Fools seldom attained a sitter's chair or held it long, and Ramanda had held a seat in the hall for almost 80 years. This was her second time as a sitter. Egwene inclined her own head slightly, eyes cool, an acknowledgement that she had been addressed, and that she had marked the tone. A very careful balance. Kwamesa was left looking around with her mouth open, uncertain whether she was to speak the phrases, always uttered by the youngest sitter present, that opened a formal sitting of the hall. Ramanda's place gave her considerable influence and some measure of authority, yet others could override her in this. A number of sitters frowned or shifted on their benches, but no one spoke. Lirella glided into the pavilion, glided toward the blue benches. Tall for a Kyrianan woman, which made her of average height for almost anywhere else, she was elegant in blue-slashed silk embroidered on the bodice with red and gold, her movements flowing. Some said she had been a dancer before coming to the tower as a novice. By comparison, Samalin, the fox-faced green who entered on her heels, seemed to stride mannishly, though there was nothing at all awkward about the Murandian woman. They both seemed surprised to see Kwamesa on her feet, and hurried to their respective benches. In any case, Varilyn began plucking at Kwamesa's sleeve until the Arafellan woman finally sat down. Kwamesa's face was a mask of cool calmness, yet she managed to radiate displeasure. She put a great store in ceremony. "Perhaps there is reason for formal session." Lilane's voice seemed low after Ramanda's. Arranging her shawl as though she had all the time in the world, she rose gracefully, very deliberately not looking at Egwene. A beautiful woman, Lilane still was dignity incarnate. "It seems that talks with Elida have been licensed," she said coolly. "I do understand that under the law of war we need not be consulted on this, but I also believe we should discuss it in session, especially since many of us face the possibility of being stilled if Elida retains any power." That word, stilled, no longer carried quite the chill it had before Suan and Liana were healed from stilling, but murmurs rose among the watching Aes Sedai crowded behind the benches. It seemed that news of negotiations had not spread as quickly as Egwene expected. She could not tell whether the sisters were excited or dismayed, but clearly they were surprised, including some of the sitters. Janya, who had entered while Lelaine was speaking, stopped dead in her tracks, so that another knot of sisters coming in nearly walked into her. She stared at the blue, then longer and harder at Egwene herself. Romanda plainly had not heard either from the way her mouth hardened, and expressions among the two young sitters ranged from Barana's icy calm to amazed on Samalin's part and openly appalled on Salita's. For that matter, Shiriam swayed on her feet for a moment. Egwene hoped the woman would not sick up in front of the entire hall. More interesting, though, were the reactions of those Dallana had reported as speaking of negotiation. Varilyn sat very still and seemed to be suppressing a smile as she studied her skirts. But Magla licked her lips hesitantly and cast glances at Romanda from the corner of her eye. Soroya had her eyes closed, and her mouth moved as though she might be uttering a prayer. Faisella and Takima gazed at Egwene wearing almost identical tiny frowns. Then each noticed the other and gave a start, quickly assuming such regal serenity that they seemed to be mocking one another. It was very strange. Surely by now Bayanin had informed all of them what Egwene had said, yet except for Varilyn they seemed upset. They could not possibly have thought they might really negotiate an end. Every woman sitting in this hall risked stilling and execution just by being there. If there ever had been any path back except to remove Elida, it had washed away months ago when this hall was chosen. There was no going back from that. Lelaine appeared satisfied with the reactions to her words. Smug as a cat in the milk barn, in fact. But before she finished settling back onto her bench, Moria bounded to her feet. That caught every eye and caused a few more murmurs. No one called Moria particularly graceful, but the Ilianer was not a woman who bounded. "That do need discussion," she said, "but it must come later. This hall did be called by 3 sitters, asking the same question. That question must be addressed before any other. What did Akaran and her party find? I do ask they be brought in to make their report before the hall." Lelaine scowled at her fellow blue, and she could scowl with the best, her eyes as sharp as awls. Yet Tower law was quite plain on the subject for once, and well known to everyone. Often enough it was neither. In an unsteady voice, Shiriam asked Eledrin, the youngest after Quamesa, to go and escort Akaran and the others before the hall. Egwene decided she had best talk to the fire-haired woman as soon as this sitting was done. If Shiriam kept on this way, she would soon become worse than useless as keeper. Dallana darted into the pavilion amid a cluster of sisters, the last sitter to arrive, and was on her bench, draping her shawl across her elbows by the time the plump white sitter returned with the 6 sisters and led them to stand before Egwene. They must have left their cloaks on the walkway outside, because none was wearing one now. Dallana peered at them, an uncertain frown drawing her eyebrows down. She seemed out of breath, as though she had run to get there. Apparently, Eledrin felt that whether or not the sitting was formal, she, at least, should carry on with proper formality. "You have been called before the hall of the tower to relate what you have seen," she said in a strong Tarraboner accent. Her combination of dark golden hair and brown eyes was not unusual in Tarrabon, though she wore her shoulder-length hair caught in a lacy white net, rather than in beaded braids. "I charge you to speak of these things without the evasion or holding back, and to answer all questions in complete fullness, leaving out nothing. Say now that you will do so, under the light and by your hope of the rebirth and salvation, or suffer the consequences." Those ancient sisters who made this part of the hall's ceremony had been well aware of how much leeway the 3 oaths gave. A little left out here, a touch of vagueness there, and the whole meaning of what you said could be stood on its head, All the while you spoke only the truth. Karen spoke the assurance loudly and somewhat impatiently, the other 5 with varying levels of formality and self-consciousness. Many sisters had lived their entire lives without being called to testify in front of the hall. Aledrin waited until the last had repeated every word before marching back toward her bench. "Tell us what you did see, Yakaran," Moria said, as soon as the white sitter turned away. Aledrin stiffened visibly, and when she took her seat, her face was utterly expressionless, but bright spots of color highlighted her cheeks. Moria should have waited. She must have been very anxious. By tradition, there were many more traditions and customs than laws, and the Light knew there were more laws than anyone really knew, often contradictory layers of law laid down over the centuries. But tradition and custom ruled Aes Sedai as much as Tower law ever had, perhaps more so. By tradition, Akaran addressed her response to the Amerlin seat. "What we saw, Mother, was a roughly circular hole in the ground," she said, nodding for emphasis at nearly every other word. She seemed to choose those words carefully, as if to make sure she was absolutely clear to everyone. "It may have been a precise circle originally, shaped like half of a ball, but the sides have collapsed in some places. The hole is approximately 3 miles across and perhaps 1.5 miles deep." Someone gasped loudly, and Karen frowned as though whoever it was had tried to interrupt. She went on without pausing, however. "We could not be entirely certain of the depth. The bottom is covered with water and ice. We believe it may become a lake eventually. In any event, we were able to ascertain our exact location without too much difficulty, and we are prepared to say that the hole is located where the city called Shadar Logoth once stood." She fell silent, and for a long moment the only sound was the rustle of skirts as Aes Sedai shifted uneasily. Egwene wanted to shift too. Light. A hole that size would cover half of Tar Valon. "Do you have any idea how this hole was created, Akaran?" she asked finally. She was quite proud of how steady her voice was. Shiriam was actually trembling. Egwene hoped no one else noticed. A keeper's actions always reflected on the Amerlin. If the keeper showed fear, a good many sisters would think that Egwene was afraid. That was hardly something she wanted anyone to suspect. "Each of us was chosen because we have some ability at reading residues, Mother. Better than most, in truth. So they had not been chosen simply because no one stronger was interested. There was a lesson in that. What Aes Sedai did was seldom as simple as it appeared on the surface. Egwene wished she could stop having to relearn lessons she had thought already learned. Nisain is the best of us at that," Akaran went on. "With your permission, Mother, I will let her answer." Nisain smoothed her dark woolen skirts nervously and cleared her throat. A gangly gray with a strong chin and startlingly blue eyes, she had some small repute in matters of law and treaties, but she was obviously uneasy about speaking before the hall. She looked straight at Egwene with the air of someone who did not want to actually see all the sitters assembled. "Given the amount of cider used there, Mother, it was no surprise to find the residues near as thick as the snow." More than a hint of Murandy clung to her tongue, a lilting sound. "Even after so long, I should have been able to grasp some idea of what was woven, if it was at all like anything I'm familiar with, but I have none. I could all but trace the weave, Mother, and it made no sense at all. None. In fact, it seemed so alien it might not have been—" Clearing her throat again, she swallowed. Her face grew a little paler. "It might not have been woven by a woman. We thought it must have been the Forsaken, of course, so I tested for resonance. We all did." Half turning to gesture to her companions, she hurriedly turned back. She definitely preferred looking at Egwene to the sitters, all leaning forward intently. "I can't say what was done beyond scooping 3 miles out of the earth, or how it was done, but Saidin was definitely used too. The resonance was so strong we should have been able to smell it. There was more Saidin used than Saidar, much more. Dragon Mount beside a foothill, and that is all I can say, Mother. A sound fluttered through the pavilion, the sound of sisters letting out the breath they had been holding. Shiriam's exhalation seemed the loudest, but perhaps that was just because she was nearest. Egwene schooled her face to stillness. The Forsaken, and a weave that could tear away half of Tarvalon. If Malind did propose flight, could she try to make the sisters remain and face that? Could she abandon Tarvalon and the tower and the light knew how many tens of thousands of lives? "Does anyone else have a question?" she asked. "I have one," Ramonda said in a dry tone. Her calm had not cracked by a hair. "But not for these sisters. If no one has any further questions for them, I'm sure they would like to be away from having the hall stare at them." It was not precisely her place to suggest that, but neither was it precisely not, so Egwene let it pass. No one else had questions for Akarin or her companions, as it turned out, and Ramonda offered them surprisingly warm thanks for their efforts. Again, not precisely her place. "Who is your question for?" Egwene asked, as Akarin and the other five scattered to join the growing numbers of sisters crowding among the stand lamps and braziers. They were eager, as Ramonda had said, to get out from under the hall's eyes, but they did want to hear what came of their work. It was very difficult for Egwene to keep asperity out of her voice. Ramonda affected not to notice, or perhaps did not notice. "For Moria," she said. "We suspected the Forsaken from the start. We knew that whatever happened was powerful and far away. All we've learned, really, is that Shadar Logoth is gone, and of that I can only say the world is better off without that sinkhole of the shadow." She fixed the blue sitter with a frown that had made many an Aes Sedai squirm like a novice. "My question is this. Has anything changed for us?" "It should," Moria replied, meeting the other woman's stare levelly. She might not have been in the hall as long as Ramonda, but sitters were at least supposedly on an equal footing. "We have long had preparations in case the Forsaken do come against us. Every sister does know to form a circle if she be able, or join one she does find forming until every circle does reach 13. Everyone is to be brought in, even the novices, even the newest." Lelaine looked up at her sharply, but however much she wanted to chide Moria, they were of the same Aja. They must give at least the appearance of a common front. The effort of keeping her mouth shut thinned Lelaine's lips, though. Ramonda was under no such constraint. "Must you explain what everyone here already knows? We are the ones who made those arrangements. Perhaps you have forgotten?" This time her voice was cutting. Open displays of anger were forbidden in the hall, but not goading. If Moria felt the prick, though, she gave no outward sign beyond adjusting her shawl. "I must explain from the beginning, because we have no thought far enough. Malend, can our circles stand against what Akarin and Nisaim described?" Despite her fierce eyes, Malind's full mouth always looked ready to smile, but she was quite stern as she stood, and she stared at each sitter in turn as if to impress her words on them. "They cannot. Even if we rearrange matters so the strongest sisters are always in the same circle, and that means they must live, eat, and sleep together if they're to link on the moment. Even then, we would be mice facing a cat. Enough mice can overwhelm even a large, hungry cat, but not before many mice are dead. If enough of these mice die, though, the White Tower dies." Again that ripple of sighs ran through the pavilion like an unsteady breeze. Egwene managed to keep her face calm, but she had to force her fists to relax their grip on her skirt. Which would they propose, an assault or flight? Light, how could she oppose them? Same Aja or not, Lelaine could take the strain no longer. "What are you suggesting, Moria?" she snapped. "Even if we reunite the tower this very day, that won't change the facts." Moria smiled slightly, as if the other blue had said just what she was hoping someone would say. "But we must change the facts. The fact at present do be that our strongest circles be too weak. We do have no Angreal, much less Sa'angreal, so we might as well ignore them. I'm no certain there be anything even in the tower that would make a large enough difference anyway. How then do we make our circles stronger? Strong enough, we must hope, to face what happened at Shadar Logoth and stop it. Esmeralda, what have you to say on the matter?" Startled, Egwene leaned forward. They were working together, but to what end? She was not the only one to realize that the three sitters who had called the hall were all on their feet. By remaining standing, Moria and Malind had made a clear declaration. Esmeralda stood like a queen, yet the tiny brown seemed all too aware of the eyes sliding between her and Malind and Moria, the thoughtful frowns and too still faces. She shifted her shawl twice before speaking. She sounded as though she were lecturing a class, her voice thin yet forceful. "The ancient literature is quite clear, though little studied, I fear. It gathers dust rather than readers. Writings collected in the earliest years of the tower make it plain that circles were not limited to 13 in the Age of Legends. The precise mechanism, I should say the precise balance, is unknown, but it should not be too difficult to work out. For those of you who have not spent the time you should have in the tower library, the manner of increasing the size of a circle involves..." For the first time, she faltered and visibly forced herself to continue. "Involves the inclusion of men who can channel." Faisella popped to her feet. "What are you suggesting?" she demanded, and sat down immediately as though someone might think she was standing in support. "I do ask that the hall be cleared," Magla said, rising. Like Moria, she was Ilianer, and agitation thickened her accent markedly. "This do no be a matter for discussion before any save the hall in closed sitting." She too dropped back onto her bench as soon as she finished and sat glowering, wide shoulders hunched, and hands opening and closing on her skirts. "I do fear it be too late for that," Moria said loudly. She had to speak loudly to be heard over the murmur of sisters talking excitedly behind the benches, a hum like a huge beehive. "What has been said and heard by too many sisters for anyone to try shutting the words away now." Her bosom rose as she pulled in a deep breath, and she raised her voice a notch louder. "I do put before the hall the proposal that we do enter into an agreement with the Black Tower that we may bring men into our circles at need." If she sounded a trifle strangled at the end, it was no wonder. Few Aes Sedai could say that name without emotion, disgust, if not outright hatred. It struck against the buzz of voices and produced absolute silence for the space of 3 heartbeats. "That is madness!" Shiriam's shriek shattered the stillness in more ways than one. The Keeper did not enter discussions in the hall. She could not even enter the hall itself without the Amerlin. Face flooding with red, Shiriam drew herself up, perhaps to face the inevitable rebuke, perhaps to defend herself. The hall had other things on its mind than rebuking her, though. Leaping up from their benches just long enough to get their words out, sitters began to speak, to shout, sometimes on top of one another. "Madness hardly begins to describe it," Faisella shouted, at the same time that Varilyn cried, "How can we ally ourselves with men who can channel?" "These so-called Ashaman are tainted," Saroya called out, with no sign of the vaunted white Aja reserve. Hands knotted in her shawl, she trembled so hard that the long, snowy fringe swayed. "Tainted with the Dark One's touch." "Even suggesting such a thing puts us against all the White Tower stands for," Takima said roughly. "We would be despised by every woman who calls herself Aes Sedai, by Aes Sedai long in their graves." Magla went so far as to shake a fist, with a fury she did not attempt to mask. "Only a dark friend could suggest this. Only a dark friend." Moria paled at the accusation, then went bright red with anger of her own. Egwene did not know where she stood on this. The Black Tower was Rand's creation, and perhaps necessary if there was to be any hope of winning the last battle. Yet the Ashaman were men who could channel, a thing feared for 3,000 years, and they channeled shadow-stained Saidin. Rand himself was a man who could channel, yet without him, the shadow would win at Tarmangaiden. The light helped her for seeing it so coldly, but it was hard truth. Wherever she stood on the matter, matters were getting out of hand there and then. Esmeralda was exchanging insults with Faisella, both at the tops of their lungs. Open insults. In the hall. Soroya had abandoned the last shreds of white Aja coolness and was screaming at Malind, who screamed back, neither waiting on the other. It would have been a wonder if either could understand what the other was saying, and perhaps a blessing if they could not. Surprisingly, neither Romanda nor Lelaine had opened her mouth since the beginning. They sat staring at one another, unblinking. Likely each was trying to read how the other would stand, just so she could stand in opposition. Magla got down from her bench and stalked toward Moria with the glare of someone eager to come to blows. Not words, but fists. Magla's were clenched at her sides. Her vine-worked shawl slid off onto the carpets unnoticed. Standing, Egwene embraced the source. Except for certain exactly prescribed functions, channeling was forbidden in the hall. Another of the customs that pointed to darker days in the hall's history. But she made a simple weave of air and fire. "A proposal has been laid before the hall," she said, and released Saidar. That was not as hard as it once had been. Not easy, not close to easy, but not as hard. A memory of the power's sweetness remained, enough to sustain her until the next time. Magnified by the weave, her words boomed in the pavilion like thunder. Aes Sedai shrank back, wincing and covering their ears. The silence after seemed incredibly loud. Magla gaped at her in astonishment, then gave a start at realizing that she was standing halfway to the blue benches. Hastily unloosing her fists, she paused to snatch up her shawl and hurried back to her own seat. Shiriam stood weeping openly. Surely it had not been that loud. "A proposal has been laid before the hall," Egwene repeated into the silence. After that power-magnified blare, her voice rang in her own ears. Perhaps it had been louder than she thought. That weave had never been intended for use inside walls, even patched canvas walls. "How speak you in support of an alliance with the Black Tower, Moria?" She sat down as soon as she finished. How did she stand on this? What difficulties would it present her? How could it be used to advantage? The light help her indeed. Those were the first two things to come to mind. She wished Shiriam would dry her eyes and straighten her backbone. She was the Amelin seat, and she needed a keeper, not a milksop.
Excuse me.
It took a few minutes for order to restore itself. Sitters straightening clothes and moving skirts unnecessarily, avoiding each other's eyes and especially not looking at the watching sisters crowded behind the benches. Some sitters' faces became stained with red that had nothing to do with anger. Sitters did not shriek at one another like farmhands at shearing, most especially not in front of other sisters. "We do be faced with two seemingly insurmountable difficulties," Moria said finally. Her voice was composed and cool once more, but a hint of flush still hung in her cheeks. "The Forsaken have discovered a weapon. Discovered or uncovered. They surely would have used it before now had they possessed it. A weapon we can no counter. A weapon we can no match, though the light do know why we would wish to. But most importantly, a weapon we can neither survive nor stop. At the same time, the Ashaman have grown like weeds. Reliable reports do put their numbers at nearly equal to all the Aes Sedai living. Even if that number do be inflated, we can no afford to believe it exaggerated far, and more men come every day. The Eisendeers do be too consistent to believe anything else. We should take these men and gentle them, of course, but we have ignored them because of the Dragon Reborn. We have put them off to be dealt with later. The bitter truth do be that it be too late to try taking them. They do be too many. Maybe it did be too late when we did first learn what they were doing. If we can no gentle these men, then we must control them somehow. An agreement with the Black Tower. Alliance be too strong a word. With a carefully worded agreement, we can take the first steps toward protecting the world from them. We also can bring them into our circles. Raising a cautionary finger, Moria ran her gaze along the benches, but her voice remained cool and composed and firm. We must make it clear that a sister will always meld the flows. I do not suggest letting a man control a linked circle, but with men in the circles we can expand them. With the blessings of the light, perhaps we can expand the circles far enough to counter this weapon of the Forsaken. We do kill 2 hares with 1 stone. But these hares do be lions, and if we do no cast that stone, one of them will surely kill us. It is as simple as that. Silence fell, excepting Shiriam at least. Standing hunched in on herself a few feet from Egwene, shoulders shaking, she still had not mastered her weeping. Then Ramonda sighed heavily. Perhaps we can expand the circles enough to counter the Forsaken, she said in a quiet voice, in a way that gave her words more weight than if she had shouted. Perhaps we can control the Ashaman? A thin word, perhaps, in either context. When you do be drowning, Moria replied, equally quiet. You do grab at whatever branch floats by, even when you can no be sure it will support your weight until you have hold. The water has no closed over our heads yet, Ramonda, but we be drowning. We do be drowning. Again there was silence, but for Shiriam's sniveling. Had she forgotten all self-control? But then no one among the sitters wore a pleasant expression, not even Moria or Melend or Esmeralda. It was not a pleasant prospect that lay in front of them. Delana's face had turned decidedly greenish. She looked as if she might be the one to sick up, rather than Shiriam. Egwene stood once more, long enough to ask the required question. Even when the unthinkable was proposed, the rituals must be followed. Perhaps more so then than ever. Who speaks against this proposal? There was no shortage of speakers there, though everyone had regained herself enough for them to follow protocol. Several sitters moved at once, but Magla was first on her feet, and the others sat back with no outward displays of impatience. Faisella followed Magla, and Varylin followed Faisella. Then came Saroya, and finally Takima. Each spoke at length, Varylin and Saroya coming very near making the forbidden speeches, and each spoke with all the eloquence she could summon. No one reached a sitter's chair lacking eloquence at need. Even so, it soon became clear that they were repeating themselves and each other, just in different words. The Forsaken and their weapon were never mentioned. The Black Tower was the sitter's topic. The Black Tower and the Ashaman. The Black Tower was a blight on the face of the earth, as great a threat to the world as the last battle itself. The very name suggested connections to the Shadow, not to mention being a direct slap at the White Tower. The so-called Ashaman, no one used the name without adding so-called or saying it with a sneer. Guardians it meant in the old tongue, and they were anything but guardians. The so-called Ashaman were men who could channel. Men doomed to go insane if the male half of the power did not kill them first. Madmen wielding the one power. From Magla to Takima, every one of them invested that with every scrap of horror in them. 3,000 years of the world's horror, and the breaking of the world before that. Men like this had destroyed the world, destroyed the age of legends, and changed the face of the world to desolation. This was who they were being asked to make alliance with. If they did so, they would be anathema in every nation, and rightly. They would be scorned by every Aes Sedai, and rightly. It could not be. It could not. When Takima finally sat, arranging her shawl carefully along her arms, she wore a small but quite satisfied smile. Together, they had managed to make the Ashaman seem more fearsome, more dangerous than the Forsaken and the last battle combined, maybe even a match for the Dark One himself. Since Egwene had begun the ritual questions, it was for her to finish, and she rose long enough to say, "Who stands for an agreement with the Black Tower?" She had only thought there was silence in the pavilion before. Shiriam had finally governed her weeping, though tears glistened on her cheeks still, but her gulp sounded like shouts in the quiet that followed that question. Takima's smile slid sideways when Janya stood as soon as the question left Egwene's mouth. "Even a slim branch is better than no branch when you're drowning," Janya said. "I'd rather try than trust to hope until I go under." She had the habit of speaking when she was not supposed to. Samalin rose to stand beside Malind, and suddenly there was a rush. Salita and Barana and Eledrin together, with Quamesa only a tick behind. 9 sitters on their feet, and there it hung as the moments stretched out. Egwene realized she was biting her lip and stopped hurriedly, hoping no one had noticed. She could still feel the impression of her teeth. She hoped she had not drawn blood. Not that anyone was looking at her. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath. Romanda sat frowning up at Salita, who was staring straight ahead, her face gray and her lips trembling. The Tyran's sister might not be able to hide her fear, but she was going ahead. Romanda nodded slowly and then, shockingly, stood. She, too, decided to violate custom. "Sometimes," she said, looking straight at Lilane, "we must do things we would rather not." Lilane met the gray-haired Yellow's eyes without blinking. Her face might have been cast in porcelain. Her chin rose by slow increments. And suddenly she stood, glancing down impatiently at Lirella, who gaped at her a moment before coming to her feet. Everyone stared. No one made a sound. It was done. Almost done, anyway. Egwene cleared her throat, trying to catch Shiriam's attention. The next part was the keepers, but Shiriam stood, scrubbing the tears from her cheeks with her fingers and running her eyes along the benches as if counting how many sitters were standing and hoping to find she had been counted. Egwene cleared her throat more loudly, and the green-eyed woman gave a start and turned to stare at her. Even then, it seemed to take forever before she recalled herself to her duty. "The lesser consensus standing," she announced in an unsteady voice. "An agreement will be sought with the Black Tower." Inhaling deeply, she straightened to her full height, and her voice gained strength. She was back onto familiar ground. "In the interest of unity, I ask for the greater consensus to stand." That was a powerful call. Even on matters that could be decided by the lesser consensus, unanimity was always preferred, always strived for. Hours of discussion, days might go into reaching it, but the effort would not stop until every sitter agreed, or it was clear as well water that there could be no agreement. A powerful call, one that tugged at every sister. Delana rose like a puppet drawn up against her will, looking around uncertainly. "I cannot stand for this," Takima said, against all decorum. "No matter what anyone says, no matter how long we sit, I cannot and I will not. I will not!" No one else stood either. Oh, Faisella shifted on her bench, half moved as if to stand, adjusted her shawl, twitched again as if she might stand. That was as close as anyone came. Soroya was biting her knuckle with an expression of horror, and Varalyn wore the look of a woman who has been hit between the eyes with a hammer. Magla gripped the ends of her bench, holding herself in place and staring bleakly at the carpets in front of her. Plainly she was aware of the scowl Ramonda was aiming at the back of her neck, but her only response was to hunch her shoulders. Takima should have been the end of it. There was no point in seeking the greater consensus when someone made it plain she would not stand. But Egwene decided to make her own break with decorum and protocol. "Is there anyone who feels she must leave her chair over this?" she asked in a loud, clear voice. Gasps filled the pavilion, but she was holding her breath. This could shatter them, but better to have it out in the open now if that was what was to come of it. Soroya looked at her wildly, but no one moved. "Then we will go forward," she said. "Carefully. It will take time to plan exactly who is to approach the Black Tower and what they are to say. Time for her to plant a few safeguards, it was to be hoped. Light, she was going to have to scramble to deal with this. First, are there suggestions for our embassy?" Chapter 20. In the Night. Long before the sitting ended, in spite of the cloak folded beneath her, Egwene's bottom was quite numb from the hard wooden bench. After listening to endless discussion, she wished her ears were numb as well. Shiriam, forced to stand, had begun shifting her feet as if wishing for a chair, or maybe just to sit down on the carpets. Egwene could have left, freeing herself and Shiriam. Nothing required the Amerlin to stay, and at best her comments were listened to politely, after which the hall galloped off in its own direction. This had nothing to do with the war, and with the bit between their teeth, the hall was not about to let...
Alright, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by and show me support. I definitely appreciate all y'all. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.